Disaster risk financing in Latin America and the Caribbean is a matter of survival. My name is Renata Alvarenga. I'm from Brazil. I have a master in public policy from Harvard University. I also work at the World Bank on disaster risk financing as a consultant, and I'm the founder and executive director of an NGO based in Brazil that works on gender and climate justice called Empodera Clima. I want to start today telling you about something personal that has been in my mind, haunting my days and nights for the past several weeks, which is actually something that's happening very close to my home. Porto Alegre is where I'm from. It's a city that's the capital of Rio Grande do Sul. It's the southernmost state in the south of Brazil and called Rio Grande do Sul. And for the past several weeks, since the beginning of May, we've been dealing with our worst climate disaster in history. Imagine your city, the places you grew up in, the parks you went to, the markets you went to with your family, underwater. That's the situation right now where I grew up in. It's really hard to see that working on the climate space and wonder what to do about it. Right now, it's about 600,000 people displaced as a result of this climate disaster, one of the worst ever in the history of Brazil. It's about 90% of the state is affected. Of 497 cities, 90% have been affected by these floods, these really heavy floods. And so this gets me thinking, what can we do to best prepare? What could we have done for the situation to be different, to not affect so much of such precious places to me, to my family, to my friends, and to so many millions of people? There's a lack of disaster preparedness in Latin America and the Caribbean. Across the entire region, floods and storms are one of the biggest forms of disasters in the past 20 or so years. And Latin America and the Caribbean is the most disaster-prone region, the second most disaster-prone region in the world. So among the most, especially in the Caribbean when we think about small island developing states that are facing hurricane seasons every single year. However, when we think about preparedness, especially access to climate funding in order to best prepare and even maybe prevent a disaster like this, like the one that happened in my hometown and home state from happening, we see that there's a lack of that as well. Whether it's lack of actual funding available or how to access these pots of money that do exist, but they're not reaching the countries, the regions, the neighborhoods, the towns that need it the most. Not only is disaster preparedness a matter of survival, it's actually saving people's lives because it's building that climate resilience before a disaster even happens. It's actually more cost effective. For every dollar spent reducing disaster risk, $7 will be saved from economic losses associated with the aftermath of when a disaster strikes, whether it's cleanup, recovery, or even reconstruction, which is the most costly and expensive process of them all. And so, this gets me thinking, what could we have done differently? What kind of funding, what kind of access could we have reached in order to prevent these situations from happening? And you can tell me, well, these disasters are not really predictable, right? Disasters have been happening for decades, for centuries. We don't know when they will hit, they're random. But I'm here to tell you that actually that's not the case. The reality is that about half of every disaster in the world, whether it's a financial disaster, a climate crisis, a humanitarian disaster, they are somewhat predictable, about half of them, 50%. About 20% of them are highly predictable. Yet, only about 1% of all funding goes to anticipatory action, to the actions that happen before a disaster takes place. And well, here's important to think the role of disaster risk financing. There's ex-post finance, which is the traditional finance that we see on grants and loans that go to a specific country or region when a disaster takes place and help them reconstruct. But what a lot of people don't know is that funding can take months to be dispersed. And when we're talking about lives lost, when we're talking about people that have lost every single thing they own, they need money fast to fix, to reconstruct, to rebuild, to restart their entire lives. But the issue is ex-post finance doesn't bring that immediate liquidity. Ex-ante finance brings that immediate liquidity. That could be insurance, for example. In the Caribbean, there is a facility called CRIF, the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, which provides multiple forms of insurance products for Caribbean islands. And so if you want to insure your country, your region, your territory from floods, you can get flood insurance or drought insurance or hurricane insurance, whatever it is that's available. And that protects you and insures you in order to be able to rebuild quicker, faster, and better when a disaster happens. That can also be contingent credit. So some countries are able to separate a contingent line of credit that can be accessed pending a trigger. So it could be a policy trigger, like a country declares a state of emergency. And what that means is now this contingent line of credit can be passed on. It can be delivered quickly to the country that needs it the most. And so these products exist. The issue with them is very simple. Although they're more effective, although when we do have this anticipatory finance, we have better results, we have more climate resilience, there's actually less funding allocated to it. So here it's important to discriminate that anticipatory action can be humanitarian, right? And it can be any actions that's taken before a disaster happens, such as providing cash transfers so that the most vulnerable populations can access some sort of financing to get their food, to be able to have access to clean water when they're facing a disaster. However, that's the minority. Even though they're more effective, the earlier the finance, more effective, less disbursement is available. Besides the really anticipatory finance that comes as the first thing for a disaster, there's also the pre-agreed, pre-arranged finance. I mentioned insurance, I mentioned the contingent lines of credits. So these types of products, they exist, they're available, and although they're not delivered before a disaster, as soon as a disaster hits, they go into the government's accounts. That's helpful for climate resilience. That's helpful for countries to rebuild faster. Because what happens for a lot of Latin America and the Caribbean, it's happening right now for my own state, is that these countries are stuck in a vicious cycle of debt. They're facing difficult scenarios already financially and economically due to multiple reasons, whether it's colonization, whether it's just difficulty to access a lot of powerful decision-making spaces that are not made for the developing world, for the global south of our planet. When a disaster hits, this just gets worse. And so the unplanned crisis finance, even though that's actually the majority of the finance, that is not the most helpful. Taking months to solve a crisis and to disburse the funds means that maybe more people lost their lives, means that people have had to relocate and are no longer able to call their little neighborhood or area home. And that has so much trauma associated with it, so much eco anxiety associated with it. And so for the Global South, disaster risk financing is crucial and urgent. And so my proposal here is actually that we strengthen the humanitarian and development nexus. What does that mean? The humanitarian sector is very good at fast responses, right? They're good at establishing an emergency response, at delivering food quickly when it needs to be delivered, and really helping people that are most vulnerable when a conflict and crisis takes place. The development sector, whether it's an international financial institution, a multilateral development bank, they're really good at disbursing funds. They know the funding that's needed. They have access to large pots of money, and they can direct that to the developing world. However, those two sectors are oftentimes not in conversation. And so my proposal for my research has been to connect the social protection side of things to the disaster risk financing side of things, because oftentimes the reality is they're not really in conversation. And so the disaster risk financing exists, a lot of times it's in place, but it's not talking to the social protection mechanisms and systems that exist within governments. That was very clear during the pandemic, right? Where we're trying to protect people, to assist the most vulnerable, to target the real beneficiaries of the climate crisis, that needed help after the climate crisis. But the funding was not reflecting that. And so in the pandemic, a new movement was seen for the shock responsive social protection. What that means is that the social response had to respond to shocks, whether it's COVID-19, a global pandemic, whether it's a hurricane, whether it's a devastating flood like it happened in my home state and hometown. So anticipatory action is where these two elements meet. It's where we're able to not only be responsive to a shock, but actually proactive about a shock. And we need that to reflect the funds that are dispersed. We need to make sure that small governments that sometimes do not just have the capacity to connect their civil defense systems to their social protection systems. And what happens is countries are not prepared to face the climate crisis. What happens is vulnerable people don't evacuate areas that are prone to landslide, and they end up losing everything they have. And so I want you to understand that the situation is urgent, it's very serious, and it's happening right now. It's no longer an issue for the future. These disasters are happening right now. This past month, it was the southernmost state of Brazil. Next month, where else could it be? It's already happening all over the world, but we know that the most vulnerable groups, the most vulnerable states, islands, are the ones that are going to be affected first. And yet, they contributed the least to the climate crisis. And so there's a really big argument about connecting these agendas further and further. When I was growing up, when I was first becoming aware of what climate change was and truly just understanding these connections as a young girl in Brazil, this is the image I often saw a lot. The polar bear standing in the melting ice caps and just hungry, starving, having nowhere to go. That was the situation that I saw. That was the poster image, the poster picture of the climate crisis back in the day. I'm sure everyone has seen it. But there's an issue with that. That doesn't reflect what a lot of these countries that I just mentioned all across Latin America and the Caribbean are facing. We can't really resonate with that. We can't really relate, depending on where you are. But definitely for me, as a girl growing up in a tropical country, I saw this and I didn't really understand the urgency. It wasn't related to the Amazon rainforest. It wasn't related to the heavy floods that we already had back then in my hometown. And so we need to change our stories and how we communicate the climate crisis. Because even though there's so many people nowadays working in this space, when it comes to directing the resources and making sure that policymakers and governments are considering climate justice and climate action into their work, we need to bring it closer to home. And there's something interesting to be mentioned, which is called the preparedness paradox. So I mentioned, of course, that the disaster preparedness in Latin America and the Caribbean is very weak. And the preparedness paradox says that even when there's investment in the preparedness, in the prevention of a climate disaster, oftentimes it can be seen as a waste of time, a waste of funding, because the results can oftentimes be invisible. You don't really see the disasters happen if the community is strong, if the community is resilient, equipped with cash transfers, with insurance mechanisms, with all the financial or humanitarian tools they need to be able to adapt, to be able to resist these climate events, because they are happening. They're not a matter of if, but a matter of when. And so the preparedness paradox considers that really, okay, this is happening, but can we do something about it? There's also a term called the CNN effect that's talking about how the policy decisions that we make, that our governments make, are often shaped by what's most interesting to be broadcasted in the media, in the news. And as we know, when a big disaster happens, whether it is a hurricane, an earthquake, a big floods, we know that that makes the news. And whatever organizations send emergency, urgent grants to a government, they are in the news and they're praised for that. And that results in more political will, in more political support. But the reality is, without climate resilience, without investment and funding into what happens before the disaster, even if it's invisible, even if that just means that vulnerable communities are now stronger to resist the climate crisis, we're not going to solve this issue. And we don't have a lot of time. This polar bear image that you're seeing right now, for me, has changed completely very recently. It's actually become a horse in canoas in a city nearby from where I live, where I actually have quite a few family members in. One of the neighborhoods completely flooded. You can see that there's water all up to the roof, and there's a horse stranded there with literally no way to get out. He was thankfully saved with a helicopter and just by the mobilization of Brazilians from everywhere in the country that wanted to help and wanted to do something about protecting our biodiversity and about saving people that are already in this horrendous and scary situation. And so this for me resonates. This is the climate crisis in my own backyard, in my own home. And that's really scary. Again, imagine having the places you grew up submerged underwater. How long is that going to take to be reconstructed? How long is the airport in my hometown that's closed until the end of the year gonna be able to reopen? And by the way, not a small state, a state that's almost the size of the country of Italy, the size of Poland, that produces 70% of the rice for all of Brazil. So there's so many things at play. For Caribbean governments, for example, tourism is based on nature. So if we don't protect nature, if we don't protect our ecosystems, our beaches, our fishing industry, how are we gonna continue to develop? How are these governments, these countries that are developing economies, gonna be able to move forward and to reach their developed state, as they have been trying to do for so many decades? So the bottom line here is the cost of inaction is already too high for Latin America and the Caribbean. In fact, it's already too high everywhere around the world. Governments, decision makers, international financial institutions often underestimate how high this cost of inaction is. Sure, it's expensive to complete the just energetic transition. Sure, it's expensive to take some people out of the fossil fuel related jobs and move them into clean energy jobs. But the cost of what's going to happen if we do not do that in the next couple of years is way too high. And we're already seeing that. First, the people that are most vulnerable in society, women, children, indigenous peoples, the people that are really at the forefront of social inequality, but really should have a say, should have a voice. They have a voice, but oftentimes it's not amplified and translated into the decision high-level making spaces, including in disaster risk financing, which leads us to where we are. And so disaster preparedness has to be an investment. It's actually the best investment for long-term climate resilience. We have to talk about climate mitigation, sure. How do we reduce greenhouse gases? How do we stop global warming? How do we try to decrease the speed of what's happening all over the world? Because it is really scary. It is getting hotter and hotter by year. However, we need to focus and invest, put money into climate adaptation. Why? Well, it's happening right now. We can't really be discussing carbon dioxide emissions if people don't have homes anymore because of floods. They'll have to reconstruct what they've worked towards for their whole lives. And so if countries not only want to be more cost effective, right? If countries want to save money in the long term, remember, $1 in the preparedness saves $7 in the cleanup, recovery, and reconstruction. That's a big amount. And a lot of countries in the developing world need it. So it's a great investment, but not only that. As I said in the beginning, it will save people's lives. I know that in my hometown in Porto Alegre and in Rio Grande do Sul, there's already been over 150 people that have unfortunately lost their lives as a result, people that have become climate migrants, climate refugees, and their homes, their lands will never be the same. This time it was my home. It could be yours in any moment, and that's not to make things scary, it's to make you take action, to make you understand that disaster preparedness and climate adaptation is the best investment that we can make if we want to solve the climate crisis with justice at the forefront and making sure that our beloved planet, whether it is the beautiful small islands in the Caribbean or beautiful states across my country, across Brazil, can be preserved, can be saved. Thank you.